Often churches care more about pleasing people than they care about pleasing God and being faithful to God's word. And I think that's at the root of every single church problem ever. And related to that is what I already said, which is being embarrassed about what God's word says.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in to the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About, the podcast that talks about religion, politics, and everywhere in between. So tonight, I'm joined by Cody Lawrence, or better known as Spare No Arrows on YouTube and other social media accounts and various other places. So thank you so much, Cody, for joining tonight. I'm excited for this conversation because this I'm not sure exactly when this episode is going to go out, but it feels like the boogaloo has well and truly begun tonight with the the whole Trump situation and his convictions. So who knows, maybe we'll touch on that kind of stuff later. But as for now, thanks so much for joining me. And yeah, looking forward to getting stuck in.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And thank you for the invitation. I'm excited.
So tell us a little bit about you, who you are, what's your channel all about, and even maybe a little bit of your journey of faith, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I am a layman. I used to be a youth pastor a few years ago, and I love ministry. I wanted to be in professional ministry, and so I became a youth pastor. And especially as a youth pastor, and also after that,
mm-hmm.
I had a horrible experience at the church where I worked at as a youth pastor, and I noticed a lot of the other youth pastors and even like senior pastors and pastors in general, people who worked at churches, had also a lot of really negative experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, this isn't right. That's weird. It's weird if like the vast majority of pastors are like their lives are falling apart. It's like something's wrong here. And
the universal church hurt conundrum of this age.
Right, exactly. And so this was around the time, a few years ago, whenever deconstruction was really taking off. And I saw a lot of people kind of recognizing the same thing as me, except they were taking a different route for a solution. And so what their solution is like, well, the Bible is the problem. And so I need to abandon the Bible. And that's how I feel better about my faith. Except my solution was like, well, no, the Bible isn't the problem, because these bad churches and these churches that have all these horrible experiences, and these even myself as a youth pastor and a lot of the other youth pastors is like, there's issues here, and the solution is actually the Bible. The problem is not the Bible, the solution is. And so that kind of set me on this trail of really starting to take the Bible more seriously than I ever had previously in my life. I always loved the Word of God, but I realized like I shouldn't be ashamed of what the Bible says. And a lot of other Christians are kind of embarrassed about certain things that the Bible says. And I didn't want to be like that anymore. And then after that 2020 hit, and my opinion about politics and a lot of that kind of stuff really came down hard. And and that's kind of where it went from there. And so I started my podcast after a lot of consecutive, pretty negative church experiences, because I thought, a lot of people, especially like the leftist and like the deconstruction types, are talking about church problems, but not a lot of people are talking about church problems and calling things out like that from a conservative or from a biblical perspective. And so like, that's what I want to do. And so I made my show to talk about commentary on current events and politics and even things like false teachers and pretty much all things theology.
Yeah, and if you had to sum up kind of some of the problems that you saw, or maybe the root causes of what was kind of giving you that disillusionment with the church, I don't want to make you relive your what you went through necessarily, but if you could distill kind of what the overarching issues were that you saw, what would they be?
Basically, every issue boiled down to like two things, and they're related. And it's often churches care more about pleasing people than they care about pleasing God and being faithful to God's word. And I think that's at the root of every single church problem ever. And related to that is what I already said, which is being embarrassed about what God's word says.
Okay. Yes, it's not exactly something that's palatable for today's culture, and it's not, not an easy message to swallow for most people.
If we want our churches to grow big, which most pastors do, we have to be as winsome and as water down the Bible as much as possible, because, like you said, the Bible's offensive, and so that's what happens in a lot of churches.
Yeah, it is tough because there's the element of, I suppose, being all things to all people, and being, I guess, to an extent, maybe not using the word, I don't want to use the word relatable, but I guess relaying the gospel in a way that is relatable to people in the culture, that they can understand it. Because, I mean, I was listening to something earlier where the preacher said that, what way did he put it? That if you lead with like the fire and brimstone stuff, even though people need to hear that, if you lead with that in this culture, it doesn't go as well. And it was Matt Chandler, so I mean, I generally trust. I don't know if what that look meant from you, but mark and avoid. But his opinion on that was, people need to hear the hell message, because he was talking about Revelation and the smoke of their torment will going on forever, and he's like, this doesn't sound like the squishy, comfortable God, but people do need to hear this message. But at the same time, do you lead with that? Probably not always going to bring people with you.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's definitely a balance. I actually have a few episodes on Matt Chandler and some things to watch out for. And the ministry that he's currently the president, he was the president until he stepped down for some unfaithfulness stuff. But he's still the director of Acts 29. The church that I was previously a part of before I found my current church, they essentially kicked me out because I was too conservative, is basically what it boiled down to.
Okay. Is that for like airing your stuff too publicly, or mixing it with the Bible teaching, or what was their grounds for that?
Their main issue was my podcast, essentially. They didn't like my opinions, and they wanted me to stop having my opinions. And I said, my view was like, hey, I'm cool being here. I know we disagree on this stuff. I just want a place to come to church on Sundays. And I was trying to seek unity, and they were like, basically, you're in more words, you're not welcome here because you share the things that you do.
Yeah. And I'm, again, with those kind of church politics things, I know I've heard a lot about the Acts 29 and various things. I mean, I guess, for a while Driscoll was kind of involved in that sort of thing, wasn't he? And he was sort of in there. But then the funny thing is with the Matt Chandler situation, where he had to kind of step down from his church for a brief period. I don't know what your opinion is, but for me, that was actually one of the better examples of church discipline done right, at least from my perspective, where, he did something that it didn't get out of hand, it seems like, but it was caught very early and, reported and dealt with, and he stepped down and did his, healing process or whatever they did. But at the same time, it was caught early enough that it didn't become a huge scandal. And I was like, at the time, I was quite impressed, because I'm like, okay, maybe perhaps, he could be, I don't know too much about Matt Chandler on the whole. Same with most people, I get a kind of flavor for them, but I was kind of impressed by how that church discipline was handled. But I'm curious as to what are some of the things that what some of your opinions on him, now that we're talking about him.
Yeah, that's okay. I even though I didn't prepare for this, I'm well prepared.
No, I didn't either.
No, that's
I'm just
okay.
Curious.
I love it. I actually did a video breaking down his kind of exit sermon, or whatever you want to call it, when he stepped down. And I think I have other issues with Matt Chandler and with Acts 29 and whatever. I actually interviewed one of the pastors who was kicked out of Acts 29, and that's a horrible, awful story. Really bad stuff. But my main issue, at least with the way Matt Chandler was disciplined, was first, very rarely do churches do actual church discipline, and so that's a good thing that a church is willing to do that. But it was interesting that whenever he left, in the you'd have to go back and kind of watch the discussion, but it was my opinion on the kind of exit that he did was they were trying to downplay whatever he did as if it wasn't a big deal. But at the same time, they took some pretty heavy discipline against him. They made him step down. And so they made very clear that he was not unqualified for ministry, except they listed a lot of the things that he did, and they were breaches of pastoral qualifications. So it seemed to me like they were kind of speaking out of both sides of their mouth, saying he's qualified and also he's unqualified, and also like he's stepping down, but also he'll be back soon. It's like, how do you know he'll be back?
It's like he was on the
it all
path.
seemed weird.
Yeah, it was like more like a compromising situation. I suppose it would seem like, to me, the way I kind of thought about it was, I was wondering, would it be the equivalent of, for example, going out for coffee with a female friend, something that is like not in itself sinful or disqualifying per se, but to a pastor that it would seem like something that is a big deal?
Yeah, so that's a good
it's hard to know.
Point, because we don't know exactly what the details are. We know that he sent inappropriate texts, but also evidently his wife knew about it, or like, it's all weird, and we don't know all the details.
Yeah. Who knows? I'll leave that to his church and his elder, because I'm like, it's one of those things where, I mean, it's even with the Mark Driscoll situation, I touched on this with someone recently with him and the conference. I'm like,
yeah,
there's so much going on, and I'm like, I don't know who's in the right here. It's like, where do you go with this? Like, do I trust Mark Driscoll? Absolutely not. Do I believe that he has a point in some things? Perhaps. Is he doing it the right way? Don't know. Anyway, so then moving on to like then the content in your channel. So you mentioned that a lot of it is about kind of maybe not critiquing but commentating on church affairs and things going on. What are some of the things that interest you the most, or some of the things you talk about the most?
Yeah, a lot of the things that kind of blow up culturally, like the Mark Driscoll thing and Matt Chandler stepping down. I try to be on the forefront of commentating on that kind of thing. I'm also especially interested in not only the thing that happens itself, but people's response to the thing. Like for example, whenever the Alistair Begg thing happened, I was really interested in the way that people generally responded to that. Because, I'm not surprised whenever a pastor says something stupid every now and then. So like it's not a big surprise to me that Matt Chandler stepped down, and it's not a big surprise to me that Mark Driscoll, caused a big stir up, because he's done that before. but what I
am, his modus operandi there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but I also like to consider kind of what the general culture's response to those things are, and what that kind of means, and therefore the things that we should kind of push against or kind of lean into in those ways.
Okay. So where culture goes too far, or the pushback goes too far, and where it's sometimes where you think it's justified or needs to go a little further, that's where you kind of do you interject your own opinion on that, or is it more sort of feeling the temperature?
I have opinions on things, and I share those for sure. Yeah.
So then, it was Alistair Begg. So this one's actually interesting, because you're, as far as I'm aware, you're Reformed in general in your theology.
Yeah.
Like myself, I would consider myself somewhat in that camp as well. Certainly Calvinist. So what I wanted to get your opinion on was, it seems like we sort of on the Calvinist Reformed side tend to sort of stray into sometimes, especially with people like Alistair Begg. I agree there's a point where we need to say, okay, you're out of line here, you've said something that's truly wrong. And I'm sure that's probably the general gist of what most, I think, respectable YouTubers, yourself included, I'll include you in the respectable bunch, but that's generally what happens. But then there are people that stray into the kind of mark and avoid, heresy hunter kind of thing, and they stray into like really thinking the worst of people, or like disqualifying their whole ministry based on some sort of flippant comments. Right. How do you balance that sort of thing in your mind? Like when you see, for example, Alistair Begg saying something that's not right, and then actually refusing really to take it back, but also he's done so much good for the kingdom in most people's opinion. How do you find that balance of trying to truly commentate fairly on things without like just tarnishing people's whole reputation?
Yeah, awesome question. So first, I think our culture over the past many decades, maybe even the past 100 years, has become very soft and very, like I said, interested in pleasing people over pleasing God. And so I think what we don't want to do, you can have a wrong opinion on just about anything in two different extremes, and the culture lands in their general opinions, somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. And what we have to be sure not to do is to use the culture as our measure of the things that we believe. What we have to do is use truth as the measure of the things that we believe. And so sometimes we're going to find ourselves being an enemy of a certain kind of person versus another kind of person in a different situation. And so all that to say is there are situations where we absolutely have to mark and avoid people. I would say the probably most pastors in the world, or at least in America, let's say, are probably not qualified for being pastors. And I've thought about that a lot over the past few years. And it might sound crazy, because it sounded crazy to me when I first cooked it up. Yeah. But I think the vast majority...
Surprisingly, it doesn't sound too crazy to me.
Okay. Yeah, so I fully believe that. And so I think I fully believe that the vast majority of churches are not good churches. And so we need to reform these things. We need to hold our pastors accountable to actual pastoral qualifications. But at the same time, we do have to give grace where grace is deserved. And my opinion about the Alistair Begg situation was that he absolutely said something very stupid. I defended him, and I got horrible pushback on YouTube of people saying I'm stupid and wrong and whatever. But I thought what he said was wrong. But also what I was saying was, like, we shouldn't discount his whole ministry because of what he said. But at the same time, I heard somebody say this once, Alistair Begg, at the same time, should not discount his whole ministry for trying to die on this hill. And so, like, Alistair Begg really wanted to, like, not back down from this opinion that he had.
For anyone watching, remind everyone what that was about, because I think it was it transgenders or gays or something like that he was referring to in those comments? Yeah,
somebody at some point at a show, one of his shows, called in and asked a question. Basically, it was kind of a nuanced situation, but essentially it boiled down to, should I go to a gay wedding? Yeah. And he said, in order to love this person well, you should go to the wedding and you should give them a gift. But, and here's the key, here's the only reason that I defended him, because he said, you should not affirm this in any way. Yeah. And now I perceive that attending this wedding and giving them a gift, or wedding, I scare quotes, because it's not actually really a wedding.
I agree.
And so that was another issue with what he said. Like, it's not a wedding. You're not actually celebrating anything. But so he does recognize that you cannot affirm same-sex unions in any way, which is a good thing. And so really the only thing I disagree with him about is that attending a wedding, I believe, is in almost every situation, unless you show up with like a protest sign or something. Sure. So, like, it is possible to go to a gay wedding and not affirm it, but I think in the situation that he was encouraging this old lady to do, it was actually affirming. And so that's really the only thing I disagree with him on.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's where we can have grace when it comes to wrestling with the difficult issues, because that would come down to the actual sin is not in question there per se, but it's whether the participation in the event itself is sinful, and that's perhaps slightly less clear. Although I would say that it would, to me by attending you give it a kind of legitimacy, perhaps, or it's like to celebrate sin. Like, if you go, do you dance? Do you go and look glum the whole time? What would be your motive for going? And that's what's always tough to me, is that what would be the purpose of attending if you disapproved the whole time you were there? But I understand with family, and it's a complex situation. That's why I agree with you that grace can be given in those kinds of situations. I think the main thing that I wanted to talk to you tonight about, though, is probably eschatology. I think that's probably one of the most interesting topics that I've seen you cover on your channel, and it's actually surprisingly one that I think we've neglected on this channel a little bit, because I do think that it has an effect on politics, on our view in politics, because a postmillennialist will have a very different outlook, I would say, on the political process and what it can accomplish versus a premillennialist. So maybe if we go all the way back to the start, we could maybe outline some of these positions, but I guess the main positions would be pre, post, and a millennial in terms of the millennium as mentioned in Revelation. So do you want to give like a brief outline of what those positions would entail as you understand them?
Yeah, so first, each position has a lot of different views kind of within the position. And so one pre-mill person isn't going to be exactly the same as another pre-mill person. And so I can give like basic definitions, but there's always going to be somebody that disagrees with whatever you said.
Yeah.
But
disclaimer noted. Yeah.
Yeah. And I grew up dispensational premillennial. And I eventually, as I grew up and I went to seminary, and I kind of took on the view that everybody around me took on, which was amillennial. And I don't think I put very much deep thought into it for most of my life. Mm-hmm. And then really once I I really didn't even know postmillennialism was a position. I just thought, sure. Everybody's an amillennial. I probably didn't even know the term amillennial for a while. But I was just like, this is how the end times works. And then eventually I kind of started thinking about it, and I started reading books, and I eventually came to the conclusion of postmillennialism, which is what I am now. And so I've kind of been across the gamut, and I've also done a lot of more research recently into especially dispensational premillennialism. But here are the definitions. So first, all of these views are based around the idea of the millennial kingdom, which, like you said, is in Revelation, and it depicts a time period where Jesus is reigning. Jesus's kingdom is instituted, whatever that looks like. And we all have, each of you kind of has a different perspective on what that actually looks like. But the premillennial view, and there are two main categories of premillennialism, but both views believe that the return of Jesus Christ, all these views are in reference to the return of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So premillennials believe that Jesus will return before the millennial kingdom is instituted. Mm-hmm. And within the two premillennial views, you have dispensational premillennialism and historic premillennialism. Are you historic or are you dispensational? Or maybe
I think this is one that I'm almost, well, I don't even know if I would consider myself pre-mill per se, other than that's my sort of gut instinct. So I think, with a lot of these, I kind of reserve the right to not hold a position and kind of to be a floater, because I'll tell you why. It's because I think, as you've illustrated with your journey, that these things can be sort of swayed with time. And I've heard, especially the I don't know if you've ever watched The Evening of Eschatology with Piper, Storms,
yes,
and Doug Wilson, all those guys, and that to me, each great. One of those guys they've made a compelling argument, and I'm like, I think my instinct, the reason why I would side probably on instinct with pre-mill is probably based on the Matthew 24 on the whole being some. I know we can get into this, but I almost see that as it has happened, but also is yet to come.
Right.
I'll remember the term at some point. It's normally on the tip of my tongue, but I feel like there's elements of that where yes, Matthew 24 has been fulfilled, but also may be fulfilled again in a broader sense. So I would see, especially where it says about the suffering, you'll never see that kind of suffering in all of earth, and it'll be like nothing else. So I wondered, does that fully fulfill the criteria? I don't know, maybe John MacArthur kind of swayed me on that a little bit when I heard him talk about it. I think he's in that camp. But then again, I've heard other compelling arguments, and I said to you before the show, you've said some things as well about, on your channel that have got me thinking too. So as for the dispensational historical thing, I don't think I'm educated enough probably to make that
yeah,
call
that's okay.
right now.
Yeah, so
well, do you want to outline those real quick? Actually, if you like a very brief overview.
The very basic difference is that So dispensational premillennialism, even this is controversial, but I've got quite a few videos on dispensationalism that if people want more details, they can check out. But it is the widely accepted view, although this is contested by a lot of dispensationalists, that dispensationalism was created in the 1800s, and it is essentially what kind of defines dispensationalism is the belief that Israel and the church are two entirely separate and distinct entities that are not really related to one another. Historic premillennialism believes that Israel, like the other views, like I believe that Israel, the church is a part of true Israel. That Israel includes the church. All true believers are a part of God's people and therefore a part of Israel. But dispensationalists want to create a distinction between the two of those. And therefore, they believe that all of the prophecy in the Old Testament or pretty much all the prophecy, strictly applies to Israel and does not apply to the church. And God has kind of two separate plans for the two separate entities. And historic premillennialism, I am much more friendly towards, which basically...
Is that the same as the covenant or covenantal? Is that
the
same thing? When people say like dispies and coveys?
Yes, yeah. So a historic premillennial would be a covenant theology person, which essentially just means that God has a plan that he has revealed over time through covenants. And that this is a single united plan, and both Israel and the church are a part of this continual singular plan.
I think that has generally been my inclination overall, mainly because the ideal or the imagery of us being grafted onto Israel, that's kind of a big sort of almost seals the deal for me in that regard.
Right.
So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. So those that's the premillennial view. And then there's, I'll skip to postmill and then I'll do amill later. So postmillennial means that, which is what I am, that I believe that Jesus comes back after the millennium, after the millennial kingdom that is established. And most postmills, and actually most amills, there's some interesting overlap between each view. So like I think amill and postmill has some overlap, and also postmill and premill has some overlap. But so postmill and amill would both believe that the millennial kingdom in some way exists right now, and Jesus is yet to return, and so therefore he must come back after the millennium. And then that has a lot of kind of conclusions that we're going to get into later. But amillennialism, the third view, the name means no millennium. Millennium means no millennium. But there's clearly a millennium in the Bible. And so to be fair to amillennials, they don't actually believe that there's no millennium, but they kind of, to me, it's kind of like the position, if you don't like pre-mill or post-mill, you must be an amill, because you maybe they don't have a strict opinion on what the millennium looks like, or
it's
whatever.
Like a metaphorical millennium, perhaps.
Yeah, except an interesting note is that Revelation talks about 1,000-year reign, but post-mills and actually many pre-mills, they don't believe that the millennium is 1,000 years. So I don't think the thing that defines millennials is not believing in the literal 1,000-year reign. But a lot of millennials that I have met, and the position that I used to hold was that the kingdom is spiritual. The millennial kingdom is like a spiritual reign. It's not actually a physical reign. And this is actually where premillennialism and postmillennialism are buddies, because we both believe that the kingdom is physical. It's a real physical
literal,
kingdom.
Yeah. So you kind of found yourself in the post-mill camp after some moving around. What was it that sealed the deal for you, that kind of you headed in that direction? Yeah,
so the theology, I think, came after practical stuff. The theology kind of confirmed what I basically came to believe, just kind of looking at the world. I came to some conclusions about, like, I think God's plan is optimistic for the world. I think the church is going to, in a physical way and not a spiritual way, win in the end. God isn't going to, put us in a horrible position and then snap his fingers and Jesus comes in and fixes everything. But I believe the world is actually, and we can talk about this because this is another thing. People think I'm crazy when I say it. I actually think the world is getting better and not worse.
Okay.
and I think most people, at least when I grew up and my family and a lot of people, we generally look around us and we think the world is getting worse. And if we're looking at the past century or so, I would absolutely agree with you. Yeah, the world, at least America, is absolutely getting worse. But I think for me, if we zoom out and kind of look at the whole picture of history, I think history is absolutely getting better, and it will continue on that trajectory until the gospel covers the earth as the water covers the seas, and then Jesus will return and claim his kingdom.
Yeah, so that's the big difference, I suppose. Like you said, that the as Doug Wilson puts it, sorry to bring up, everyone seems to think Doug Wilson is like, I don't know, like David Koresh or something at the minute. I don't know what's going on at the minute, but it's like it's
because he's right about too many things. People hate him because
well,
he's
it's
right.
like there's some suspicion that he's like too influential, and I don't get it. I don't know what the mood is. Kind of, it seems like people are just kind of weird about him at the minute, but I'm sure someone in the comments section would love to correct me and tell me exactly what's wrong with Doug Wilson. But anyway, I heard him say that the Great Commission is sort of, I guess, prophetic, in that it's a set of orders that were expected to be successful. That, you know, when Jesus said to go and make disciples of all nations, that he wasn't saying that in like a forlorn hope kind of way, like this won't actually happen, but give it your best shot. But he meant it like that's the end result, that everyone will come to believe. Is that fair to say, that the idea is that everyone that's left on earth will be believing?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the Great Commission, I think God, whenever he lays out a plan, that he actually intends on accomplishing that plan, and he doesn't just give jobs to people that he knows they're not going to accomplish. And the Great Commission is one of those things that he gave to the whole church, and I believe he didn't intend on the church to fail that. Similar to the dominion mandate when he says to Adam and Noah and Abraham, and I think this also applies to the church through the Great Commission, to go be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so we have this imagery of filling the earth all throughout the Bible. And I don't see that just being cut off because we failed at some point, but that it's actually going to succeed. So yeah. Totally agree.
It's probably. Would you say then that doesn't mean that there won't be sin in the world, but that people will be in submission in the same way that me and you are? Is that the idea?
So I think the new heavens and new earth won't be created and instituted until after Jesus returns, and up until that point, there will still be sin in the world. The world won't be a sinless place, but at the same time, the world will be saved. Just like you and me, after we're saved, we still sin, but we're purified through our faith in Jesus. Yeah.
What makes you believe that that the world will be saved? Other than, I know you mentioned there that the Great Commission obviously kind of gives us some things, and there's that kind of dominion of the earth. But is there anything more specifically that gives you reason to be optimistic rather than to think, okay, this is going to hell in a handbasket?
Yeah, I definitely have more substantial reasons, but I think it deeply resonates with me that God has a good plan for the world. And you always hear that, like, God has a good plan for your life. God has a good plan for the world. You always hear that. But whenever I started thinking about that, when I was younger, was like, God has a good plan for the world, but he really wants to, all the stuff you hear from the dispensational premillennials, like, all that's going to happen? That doesn't actually sound good. And then they say things like, well, it's good once God comes back, or it's good after you die, or whatever. And I'm not expecting the world to be perfect, or to the postmillennial kind of ideal kingdom in my lifetime. But at least I can feel like I'm working towards that, and my work isn't just useless because everything's going to get jacked up one day and whatever. So I think there's a coherence in my mind about, like, the Bible gives us certain responsibilities, and we have to share the gospel, and we have to work, and we have to build things, and we have to live our lives a certain way. And that, to me, intuitively makes more sense with the postmillennial view that actually says that stuff's actually going to stick around, and what you're doing now is going to impact things for potentially hundreds or thousands of years whenever Jesus decides to come back, however long it takes for the gospel to fill the earth. But I've got biblical reasons too, and one that I was going to bring up was the dominion mandate and the Great Commission, which we already talked about, which is, I think, when God gives a command to his people, he intends on them actually accomplishing it, especially when that command is repeated as often as the dominion mandate was. But also the most quoted psalm in the New Testament is Psalm 110, and the first two verses say, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. And so there's this picture of like Jesus is with God until his enemies are made his footstool. And so I agree with that. There's Matthew 24, which you already mentioned, and maybe you have a different perspective on this. But in Matthew 24, Jesus gives all this prophecy of destruction and all that. But then he says something to me that just like I can't get around. Once I saw this verse, I was like, I can't be a non-millennial anymore. Like this is pure postmillennialism. And Jesus says, after all the destruction and all the prophecies he gives, he says in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And the obvious reading of that is that this generation refers to the generation that he's actually talking to. Now, some people, especially dispensationalists, will take the position that this generation means, the reader, because obviously Jesus is going to come back in my lifetime. He could come back tomorrow. And so this generation must be whatever generation it is when Jesus returns. But to me, that's useless because it's like it means whatever you want it to mean whenever it happens at the time. And that's not how prophecies work. Prophecies are very specific. But also, Jesus is answering a question of these people, and he's not describing something that's going to happen in some far off age, but he's like, this is going to happen soon. And not only is it going to happen soon, but it's going to happen in this generation's lifetime, the generation that he's talking to. And in fact, it does with the destruction of the temple in AD 70.
Sure. And does that, so to a post-millennial, that would be the thing that I guess heralded the beginning of the millennium? Is that is that kind of what that is?
Yeah, so I would say the beginning of Christ's reign it was the ascension. So when Jesus ascended in Acts and he sat at the right hand of the Father, that was him sitting down on his throne. And so Jesus is ruling over the world physically. Like this is his physical kingdom because I'm a physical thing. So some people say like, well, Jesus is in heaven and so therefore his reign isn't physical. And I'm like, okay, Joe Biden is in Washington. He's not in your living room. And so, but Joe Biden is still the president of you. Sure. Right. Yeah. So just because Jesus isn't physically right next to you doesn't mean that he's not ruling. But also you could look at it another way and say God is omnipresent, is he not? And so he's everywhere physically. So anyway,
So 87, or sorry. So you have the ascension of Jesus. I've heard others say as well that the Pentecost is kind of like a consummation of that, sort of like it's almost like there's a period of overlap, I suppose, between the ascension and the destruction of the temple. And some say that that's like an inter era kind of
between
overlap.
Ages. I believe that was a kind of a transitionary period between ages where the old age passed away at the destruction of the temple, and the church and the church age started, I think, at Pentecost. So I think Jesus became king at the ascension. Jesus was inaugurated, let's say, at the ascension, and the church age began at Pentecost, and the old covenant age ended at the AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. So I do believe there was kind of a transitionary period.
And to be specific then, what is the significance of the destruction of the temple in terms of what was spoken about the beginning of the millennium? Was that mentioned in I guess Revelation or Daniel or any of the other kind of places?
Yeah, so a lot of scholars interestingly want to say that, I think the majority, a lot of scholars want to say that Revelation was written after AD 70 because it seems to describe things
Yeah.
a little too well. But
Right.
to me, it's like, well, that's what prophecy is. Prophecy is foretelling the future. And so anyway, I believe that Revelation was written prior to AD 70. And so I
Okay.
think a lot of the, I think up until, I forgot exactly what chapter, I think it's 20, up until around Revelation 20, I think applied to the future from when it was written, but the past to us. So I do believe in a final resurrection. I do believe in the resurrection of the dead and Jesus' return and the new heavens and new earth. I believe in all that, but I believe that a lot of the destruction stuff is already fulfilled through the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay. Yeah. And that again would fulfill Daniel, I suppose, when people say about the abomination and desolation. There's kind of a link to that as well. So would you say then that kind of preterist or partial preterist view is kind of inherently built into the postmillennial view?
Yeah, I think you. I don't know if it's possible to be a postmillennial and not be a partial preterist. Yeah, so I think so.
Yeah. I suppose you could conceivably be a postmillennialist and not be a preterist, but you would have to then presume that millennium has yet to begin somewhere.
It'd be weird
For some other. Yeah. I've never heard anyone. I'm actually curious now that if there's anyone out there that that believes that. But so really, I guess what it boils down to is why does the positioning of a millennium that may or may not be a literal 1,000-year reign, I'll rephrase that. Not the may or may not be a literal 1,000 years. And why does that matter? If it's if we don't really know, if it's hard to know, does it affect our day-to-day lives? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so I think the most helpful question that I found to ask is not if it's literally 1,000 years or not, because I don't believe it's necessarily literally 1,000 years, because the millennium I believe was instituted in AD 7 or at the Ascension in 33 AD, and it's been over 1,000 years. So I have to believe that it's a kind of metaphorical years, and I think the 1,000 is just a number of completeness, and we see 1,000 being used for some complete number in the Bible all the time. But what I think is really helpful to consider is the question: is Jesus reigning now? Is Jesus king now, or is he king later? Is Jesus waiting to become king once he returns, or is he physically reigning over a real life kingdom right now? And that view, and also the idea, I think this ties in, of course, to when exactly Jesus is going to return, because in the pre-millennial view, it's baked in that Jesus is going to return potentially the soonest of all three views. Postmillennialism believes Jesus is going to return later, and amillennialism, Jesus could kind of come back whenever. So this is where kind of pre-mill and amill kind of touch, because Jesus could come back anytime. And in post-mill, there's a very specific set of things that we can expect that says that it's going to be a while before Jesus comes back. And this, to me, I didn't used to think that it mattered too much. I hear a lot of people say that there's a fourth option called pan-millennial, where everything's just going to pan out. And I think that's a cop-out. And I think people who say that know that it's a cop-out too, because obviously everything's going to work out.
There are people out there that really do take Revelation as being so vague and so full of imagery that they believe it's basically useless, and you can't apply it to anything ever because it's too vague. But see, I don't understand, because it's it may not be literal, it may be metaphorical, but it is referencing literal events, I believe, and I think most mainstream positions would probably agree with that. Yeah, or the idea that just because there's so much disagreement on this, I don't exactly know what it looks like, and so I'm just going to trust God that everything's going to work out. Except I think that eschatology actually does have a really important impact on how we live our lives. And here's an analogy I like to use. If you were making an investment, if you were putting your money into something, and you knew, or you had some idea that you're going to get your money back in the next week or so, potentially, or let's say the next eclipse, you're going to make
a lot more risky decisions. You're going to put your money in a lot higher risk of a place. And that would be wise of you to do so, because you would have a chance of getting back more money. But if you thought that you were going to get your money back in 1,000 years, and actually your great, etc. grandkids are going to get your money back, you would make a much more steady and low risk decision with that investment. And so I think our choices that we make every day is deeply impacted with our eschatology, or when we think Jesus is going to come back and what the end times look like. And I think that's reflected in, especially, I keep going back to dispensational premillennialism, but the kind of revival movement and a lot of the, the big tent revivals and that kind of thing, like the Billy Graham crusades and like the quick evangelism and altar calls, that kind of stuff, I think directly came out of dispensational premillennialism. Because if Jesus could come back any day now, then you essentially should drop whatever you're doing and try to save as many people as possible with as shallow of a theology as possible in order to save the broadest number of people. That would be the smartest decision for us to make. Now, I think, thank God, not all premillennials are consistent with that, because I think that it is awful to do that. And if you're a postmillennial, then what we believe is playing the long game. We think that, we don't know exactly when Jesus is going to come back, but we know it's going to be a while. It's certainly not going to be in our lifetimes. And so we are still interested in sharing the gospel with people, but we are more interested not in merely bringing somebody up to the altar or praying a sinner's prayer, but we want to create disciples. And we want to be creating disciples and building churches and these things that last for generations. And the some premillennials, I'm not saying you, but some premillennials who believe like Jesus could come back any day now, the wise view for premillennialism, if you want to do the most good in the world, is actually to not be focused on the long game, but to be focused on the short game. And based on what's true, you could be making very wise choices, or you could be making very stupid choices. So this stuff matters to me.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of gives me a lot to think about, because I was going to say that from, as you've outlined, that postmillennialism would seem to be an inherently optimistic point of view, and you could say that premillennialism would be an inherently pessimistic or fatalistic even viewpoint in certain ways. But then again, if what you said is true about feeling like you would have to go out there and save people as quickly as possible, does that then mean that postmillennials have less of an incentive to go out there and to do things that are risky? Because there is, I guess there's a tension there inherently where you do want to make disciples, you do want to have meaningful conversions, for want of a better term. You want people to be truly saved, and I guess that brings in other issues of what does it mean to be saved? What does that what does that look like? Is an altar call really salvation? All those things, but which we can go into. But at the same time, do you feel like, I guess it's the same criticism people level at Calvinists, where it's like there's not really that impetus to go out there and actually save souls? Like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I hear that criticism a lot, and to that I say, look at the fruit of postmillennialism versus the fruit of specifically, dispensational premillennialism. I think historic premillennials are much more reasonable people, but if you look at the fruit of postmillennialism, especially today, there are, I think, the ministries, and I don't actually think I'm being biased here. Like, if you look at Doug Wilson's ministry, for example, they are doing an incredible amount of outreach, and actually it's not baseless, shallow stuff. It's like deep stuff, and they're actually interested in making disciples. And compare that to, like, I went to a church a couple years ago back in my hometown in the South, in the the Bible Belt, that's saturated in altar call kind of culture, and it was terrible. Like, the pastor was trying to convince people who go there every Sunday. It's a very old church, but like he's trying to convince people that they're not saved and that they can come to the altar. And like, what does that do to people's faith? You know, like being convinced every week that you might not be saved. That's not assurance of salvation. And we are supposed to have assurance of salvation. And so I think just looking at the fruit, and of course there's always bad apples, and just like I think there's dispensational premillennials that are actually doing a good job at making disciples, and same with amillennials and historic premillennials. So it just like there are crummy postmills. But I think in general the answer to that is if you look at ministries like Apologia and Canon Press and a lot of the postmill ministries, and even in my own life, I've actually been more inspired to reach out to people and to share the gospel and that kind of thing in recent years, because of my postmillennialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and perhaps it speaks to a more universal problem with Christians in general needing to understand that despite, it doesn't really matter what eschatology you have, but there are non-negotiables that you do need to do. So you do need to share the gospel. That's a non-negotiable across all eschatological views. You do need to show love to your neighbor. It's not, those are things that are universal to Christianity and not dependent on eschatology. So, I didn't grow up in, I suppose you could say, altar call culture. I don't know if my church that I grew up in ever had a position on a lot of that kind of stuff, on eschatology especially. I don't remember us ever really talking about it.
Yeah, most churches don't really, because it's kind of a confusing and kind of divisive subject. Yeah. So most churches just don't talk about it.
I do remember us preaching on Revelation one time, but I was young at the time. But then, whenever I got married, moved here, my church is more close to that sort of side of things, the non-denominational, and does do an altar call. And I'm like, I see the value, because I guess it depends on if your theology is if you feel like there's just that impetus or that urge and that urgency to share the gospel, to help people and save souls. I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a good thing in general to have that kind of urgency. Yeah. I think that you can never know. And this is my church. I don't believe I wouldn't consider it to be a Reformed church, but for me, with my Reformed kind of tendencies, I would say it actually emboldens evangelism, because you're realizing it's not on you. So that to me is like, there's never any harm in at least proclaiming the gospel and putting it out there. But I have seen so many people, and this would be in other churches back in Northern Ireland. I've heard of churches that go for like 45 minutes of altar call, just like convincing people to try and turn or burn. And I'm like, yeah, that's a true story. I heard people have said to me, we were stuck in church for 30 minutes, 40 minutes after they're trying to convince one more person, one more hand needs to be raised. I'm just calling on with that one person. Yeah. And I'm like, that's an abuse in its own right. So it's like, I see the positives, but there's a lot of negatives in the coercion side of things. So it's like most things, when it's done right, great, but also there's, as we've talked about at the start, there's a lot of room for abuse.
I despise altar calls. It's been a part of most churches I've been to in my life, but altar calls actually came out of the Second Great Awakening from a preacher named Charles Finney. He wasn't necessarily the one who invented them, but he definitely popularized them. Yeah. And I think that was one of the worst things that happened to America. There's a book by Ray Comfort. I forgot the title of the book, but he basically goes into talking about the Billy Graham Crusades. He doesn't call them out by name, but I think there were like two organizations that did these crusades. And I actually went to a Billy Graham crusade myself when I was a kid, and of course they convinced me that I wasn't saved, and so I went to the front for an altar call, and they asked me if I was connected with the church. But what they do is that they follow up with the people after a certain number of months or whatever. And in this book by Ray Comfort, he was saying that the average amount of people who are actually living consistently with their faith after making a profession of faith at these crusade events, and like thousands and thousands of people go to each one. He said the number is like 5%
Yeah, that makes sense.
5% of people are actually living consistently with their profession of faith. And so I look at those numbers and I say, this thing just is not working. There is a different way to do this. This is bad. And so considering like we need to have an urgency to share the gospel with people and save people, I think there, like you said, there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. And the kind of thing where you just like blast people with the gospel and you leave them alone, that's not making disciples. And that actually, even though you are sharing the gospel with people, well, you're not actually saving anybody.
That's fair.
You would be far more effective if you actually do this through a church or actually walk with these people and disciple them. You'd be far more effective doing it in any other way than like the crusade style altar call, save as many people as possible kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I would have more objections to crusades than altar calls in general from my perspective. So I'll not give you pushback, but I'll give you my opinion on it. So I wouldn't necessarily believe that altar calls are bad, at least for my natural, just without thinking about it too much. Like my gut instinct tells me, I don't think altar calls are bad, but what I do think needs to be understood is that a raised hand in an altar call to me is a very, very preliminary beginner's step to actually living as a saved Christian. So, for example, like you said, and you got me beat because you've been to Billy Graham crusade. I think I've been to a Franklin Graham crusade, so you beat me on that one. So, but I was same thing. It's a message that's compelling. You don't want to be left behind. You don't want to go to hell. All that kind of stuff. So great, raise your hand. But raising your hand, yes, in itself, I do believe if you're genuine about that is I would consider you saved at that point. But what I would, this is where it gets tricky because you get into perseverance of the saints. But I would say that the real proof of the pudding is maybe more who sticks it out to baptism, or who's there in the church in 5 years' time. That's a much more or even just general growth of and good growth of a church, not exploitative growth where you see mega churches being built overnight. But you would expect to see good, steady growth in a church that's being effective. So I would take it at its face value in that I think that the altar call it can be used well and can be a good thing. And I'm sure you'd agree that there are, even in your opinion, probably exceptions to the rule where it can be used for a good thing. I don't know if it's the most effective. You might have a better, idea of how to do it, but I would say that probably I take it at face value. I take a raised hand as yes, that's someone who's saying they want to be saved. I think God probably sees it that way as well. That yes, I would assume He would see it as someone making a genuine choice to follow Him. But then the following is really the key, is do you continue to follow? That's where I stand on that.
Yeah, I agree. To clarify, I think there's nothing wrong in and of itself with walking to the front of a church and saying, I believe in Jesus now. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. What I have an issue with is the general way that works in most churches where, I've been to churches where they have as many people raise their hands as possible, and the follow-up that they do with a lot of people is nearly non-existent or actually non-existent.
Terrible.
Like they put it all on the people saying, you come to us if you want to know more or whatever. There's no discipleship happening, and it's literally just so that they can mark things on a clipboard to say, hey, look at how many people we saved last month, give us more money.
Right, sure, and that has to be, people will be judged for that, for not actually caring about the souls of people, unless you're doing the follow-up, unless you're actually, making a disciple. In that situation, it's pointless. But there were a few things I wanted to touch on actually earlier when we were talking about eschatology. So some people might bring up Satan being bound in the millennial reign. What's your opinion on that? Is he bound as of now, or is that is his authority diminished, or how would you see that?
Yeah, I think Satan is currently bound. I think that being bound does not mean that he is non-existent, and it doesn't mean that he does not still have influence in the world. And so I totally believe that Satan is bound, but obviously there's still sin in the world. Satan has influence. It's kind of like, I heard the analogy one time that, you can say, we beat Hitler, but there are still Nazis around that you're fighting. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So Satan is defeated. The seed of the woman has crushed the head of the serpent whenever Jesus came back to life. That was the absolute fulfillment of the proto-evangelion in Genesis. And so Satan is defeated. But, we are dealing with consequences of that, and Satan still definitely has impact in the world until one day he's finally for good gotten rid of.
Yeah. I think I have one more question, but I've forgotten it. So we'll leave that for there. So I think that was a good overview of the positions and your position. So then, following on from how it affects things, let's talk about how it affects politics specifically. So if someone holds a post-mill view, how do you think that should naturally affect their political outlook or their outlook on culture and society?
Yeah, there are definitely different opinions on between postmillennials and any other eschatological view. Like, I think actually a lot of premillennials, and especially ironically dispensational premillennials, are more on my team than a lot of amillennials. I think we should be trying to conquer the world for Christ, and very actively. Like, we should be spreading the. Now, that doesn't mean by force. What I mean is, like, I no tanks, but we have a very because we are the body of Christ, and because God commands us to be fruitful and multiply and to spread the gospel through the nations and teach the nations to obey. That's a command that we have, and so therefore, like, I want Christians in government. I want a world where we exclusively have Christians in government. I think the American government, whenever in 1776, objectively was far better than our government today. And so I want to work back towards getting a government that actually affirms the existence of Christ. And also it says, or the reign of Christ. Romans 13, ironically, which is the passage that everybody pointed to about, like, you got to obey the government. It says that the government are servants of God. And so if a government is living consistently with its God-given role, it actually has the responsibility, government leaders have the responsibility to be servants of Christ. So they can be bad servants, but we have to recognize they're being bad servants. So I just don't think that there's any way around wanting a Christian government.
Yeah, so you see that more as, like, they're called to be servants of God, because obviously God uses the bad governments that don't follow him as well. So it's more that they theoretically are called to follow him. Yeah, definitely. God uses Babylon to punish Israel, but also God punishes Babylon. So God can certainly use evil people as a part of his plan, but he doesn't want those people to be evil. He wants those people to serve him. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm being British. I'm a monarchist, so I naturally have an affection for Christian government. So, I mean, even if it is nominally Christian, but anyway, that's definitely a topic for another day.
Amen.
So then, a lot of people will sort of conflate that idea of conquering for Christ. Again, not in the literal way with guns and tanks, but some people would probably file that in the category of Christian nationalism. Which seems to be another hot button topic, where it's like, okay, the Christians want to take over, they want to put the gays in prison, they want to, make our kids all believe these things, and all that kind of stuff, outlaw abortion. But so, whenever you hear the term Christian nationalism, is that a term that you shy away from, or is it a term that you think is actually sums up quite well what we're called to do?
Yeah, I'm not scared of the term Christian nationalism. I see it primarily as the word was invented by the left as a tool to put against Christians, basically, who want to live faithfully. So if a person believes homosexuality is wrong, you're a Christian nationalist. Somebody recently in the news, I forgot who it was, but she literally defined Christian nationalism as the belief in God and wanting to live according to his law or some nonsense like that, which literally applies to Muslims and any religion who believes in God and wants to follow his law. And so, like, Muslims are Christian nationalists, evidently. And so I think the term Christian nationalism is unavoidable. And because you're going to be labeled it, even if you hate the term, even if you are afraid of the term, or you hate the people who are Christian nationalists, you are one, regardless. If you're a Christian, you're a Christian nationalist. And I think in terms of the word itself, well, we're Christians, and we live in a nation, and we ought to love our nation, and we ought to want our nation to be discipled. And so, yeah, I don't have an issue with the term whatsoever. But I think if I were to be entering into a conversation with somebody who I didn't maybe know their perspective on the term Christian nationalism, I might prefer to call myself a Christian, a biblical Christian.
Yeah.
But yeah, I at least am not afraid of the term.
Yeah. And maybe my eschatology plays into this, but I think my political views are naturally more libertarian on the whole. Not in terms of, I'm definitely conservative in values and societal values, but libertarian in terms of, I think my instinct would be to allow for a more pluralist society, and that I don't know, it's hard to say, because I do believe that God calls Christians to be involved in government. I absolutely agree with that. But my question in my mind is, does God really want Christians to I guess, rule the nation, to subject the nation to God's laws? And is it his plan for the governmental system to be an apparatus for him working through the world? And that's where I kind of struggle, because I wonder, does he want people just to have that freedom to respond to the call? And again, soteriology aside, well, the nature of that choice is irrelevant, but everyone has a call to follow or not to follow. And I wonder, does God want us just to hold that out and allow people to make that choice to follow him? Or are we expected to maintain a particular standard of conduct, standard of laws, and those kind of things? And that's where I'm kind of not sure about the nature of that. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think freedom is definitely a good thing, obviously. And there should be... So first, I think, just very practically, I try to think as practically as possible about a lot of these issues. I think a more Christian government is better than what we have now. And so I think we should, all Christians should ally and work towards a Christian government, even though none of us knows exactly what that looks like. Because it's better than what we have now. It's better than murdering babies and fake marriage and all the rest.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And punishing parents for their kids wanting to transition, etc. So it's better than what we have now. And because I'm a postmillennial, I believe we have a lot of time to work that out. And so I don't know exactly what the specific laws are that we should have in a perfect Christian government. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. Yeah. But I do know that whatever those laws are going to be better than what we have now. Because currently Christians are being persecuted, and currently we have absolutely no freedom. And so what I see is a lot of Christians, they are fighting against this idea of whatever you want to call it, Christian nationalism or a Christian government or theonomy or whatever, because it's like, oh, well, that would take away people's freedom. But in that world, we actually have far more freedom than anything we have right now in America. But the other thing I was going to say was, like I said, freedom's good, but the idea of like letting people kind of completely reign over their own lives, the libertarian kind of approach, I hope to God that none of us act that way towards our kids. I've seen a lot of people, not Christians, of course, but a lot of people like, my kid can make their own choice. I'll give them all these options about religions. Like, no, we want to have very strict guidelines for our kids because we want them to live faithfully. And so I think exactly the same thing applies to the general culture. Again, I don't know exactly what those laws are, and I think those laws certainly would allow for a lot of freedom. But would a Christian government give us the freedom to murder babies? Absolutely not. Would a Christian government allow us the freedom to marry, quote unquote, whoever we want? Absolutely not.
And I suppose, again, following on from the post-millennial view, you would probably think that eventually the nation will desire a Christian government, probably in the like when it'll get to a certain point where everyone's in agreement with that. I suppose maybe then my point of view would be maybe thinking in terms of I naturally would think that we're heading towards a decline, and that maybe that affects whether it's funny because I don't think I realized how much it does affect. Again, you think eschatology is just kind of a lofty topic that doesn't mean much, but it kind of, I suppose it really does have real effects on political views. So I would be thinking in a world that is on the decline and falling and will get further and further from God, that's where I would naturally probably think then it's our call just to be the light in the darkness, to hold it out, to offer it, and to just to put it out there and say, we live in a plural society. We're not going to compel you to follow what we believe, and I suppose I would maybe even argue that God probably doesn't want us to compel others to believe what we believe. And I'll let you push back on. What about your kids? Well, I think we have dominion over our family. We have authority over our family. Same way a pastor has authority over a church. But I don't think that we have authority necessarily over our fellow men. And maybe
right. Yeah, that's a good point. There's this idea that I think is really helpful called sphere sovereignty. I think it comes from Abraham Kuyper, but the idea is that there are three separate governmental spheres. There's the sphere of the family, and the sphere of the government, the civil government, and the sphere of the church. Yeah. And so I actually completely agree with you. I do not have authority over the government. I also don't have authority over the church. That's a pastor's job. However, there's definitely overlap between these spheres.
Yeah.
And like we have the right to vote, and we have the right to put our pastor into authority and so on. But God, we do not define these spheres of government. God does. And the way God defines the sphere of the civil government is that they wield his sword, and that they are supposed to reward good, and they're supposed to punish evil. And if they're not doing that, they're not doing their job. And so whenever a government gives illegitimate commands, there is a doctrine that I think we have lost in our nation that has been well developed over the course of centuries called Protestant resistance theory.
Okay.
And it's the idea that we have the right and the responsibility to resist tyrannical government. And it's because, according to God, the government is supposed to look a certain way. And so even though I don't have authority over the government, and I don't have authority over my church, that doesn't stop me from making sure my pastor is being faithful. And that also shouldn't stop me from making sure my government is being faithful. Yeah.
Well, in your opinion, then, if there were subjects of a Christian nation, let's say we were successful and got quite a hefty majority of people in government that were Christians, how would that relate, or how would they wield that authority over people who are unbelievers? Because do you think it's fair to subject someone who doesn't believe in Christian values to Christian laws?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So first, it depends on what you mean by Christian laws, because I think any good law is a Christian law. Like the law not to murder is a good law, and it's a Christian law, and I think it is not only good, but it's necessary to compel people to follow that law, because murdering is bad, right? And there's no better governmental structure than one that comes directly from God. And so I think where a lot of people get hung up on this is, do we force people to convert to Christianity? And the answer is no, because the Bible does not want people to be forced to convert to Christianity. That's through the gospel. But I think certain things, and we can use scriptural law as examples. It also doesn't mean that we just take the laws straight out of the Old Testament that God meant for Israel and then pop it into America. That's not what general equity theonomy is. That I subscribe to, but it means that we take the principles that are in God's law, and that we ought to be trying to apply them in our current system. And so we should be, as Christians, we should be fighting against, in any way we can, abortion, for example. We should be trying to limit abortion because it's a good thing, and we should be compelling people to not murder their babies. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose it's maybe more where things get a little more woolly, and a lot of people probably think of freedom of religion, for example. So, in this maybe a good place to go with this would be, as we sort of come towards the end, if I ask you sort of to dream for a minute, maybe this will answer the questions a little better. So, if someone put you in charge of, let's say God put you in charge of instituting the the best government that you could make according to his your understanding of the Bible and of his laws and that kind of stuff, how would that government look to you, and how would it relate to its subjects?
Man,
sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think if I knew that was coming, I would, like, if somebody said, hey, you're going to be president for the next year in a week, I would do as much reading as I possibly could.
Yeah.
But I think, to me, we have way too many laws. And one thing that characterizes a Christian government is not more laws, but it's less laws. Okay. And so I think, like, freedom is a good thing. Just certain things we should not have the freedom to do. Like our current government gives us freedom to do things that we absolutely shouldn't. And it does not give us the freedom to do things that we should do. Like I said, in Romans 13, governments are supposed to reward good and punish evil. Our government, and a lot of governments in the world, are doing exactly the opposite of that. And so I think I would probably, hypothetically, not worry about doing more laws, but try to remove all the evil laws that we have racked up, and, like, take away power. This is huge. I would try to take away as much power from myself as possible. If I were a president, I would make sure that every president after me has as much power as George Washington did, which was not much.
Yeah. But form of government you're okay with? What we have in America, kind of representative democracy? Yeah,
I think I heard in the political theory that the Founding Fathers came up with, our democracy has an element of monarchy where we have a president, and it has an element of republic where we have the Senate, and then we have an element of democracy, which is the House of Representatives. And so I think balance is important. I think a dictatorship is evil. Putting too much power in one person's hand, unless that person is totally righteous or, like, been given direct information from God, like the Old Testament monarchies. I think those are good things. But I think today we don't have that. We have the Holy Spirit instead. And so to take away as much option for tyranny as possible is what I would try to achieve. And and it's what I'm in my day-to-day life. It's what I try to push. And if the government gives some kind of tyrannical law, I will resist it.
And in the sort of, I don't want to put you in a category, but in the post-millennial approach to this, just to clarify, would it all be contingent on a willing populace kind of eagerly desiring a Christian government, or is there an element to where some pioneers will need to go out there and kind of implement systems that the people will then follow?
Yeah, I think so. One of the criticisms that kind of Christian nationalism receives is that people say, and I think this is a straw man, people say that we want to convert our nation through the government, but that's not what we want at all. I don't think people will come to Christ. We don't believe in compelled belief, but that's not to say, like, if you live in a Christian town, if you live in a Christian nation, if you are surrounded by church people, you're more likely to be Christian. And so I think that's just kind of a natural outpouring of that's just like the way God made the world. And so in some way, like, people will become Christians in a more Christian government, but that's not the goal. I think a Christian government will, unless America is judged to the point that we're destroyed, which is entirely possible.
Certainly.
I pray for America to repent every day, and that starts with, people like us raising our families well and being a part of a good, strong, growing church and so on, and then trying to impact our community and go out from there.
Yeah, but my wife and I we worked at she still does, but I don't anymore. But we worked at a Christian school, and again, that's to me, like, I feel like we kind of did our part there, and, like, trying to stop the indoctrination of the state, or letting the state, raise our children for us.
Yeah. So I think almost out of necessity, to have a Christian government, we would have to have a majority, or at least more Christians standing up than we have. But I think it's also possible for a Christian to get into authority and do work from the top down. So I think we definitely need to do work from the bottom up, but I think also work can be at the same time from the top down. We need to be going from both directions. I had a question for you, by the way, that you can say whatever you meant to say next. I don't want to interrupt you, but I just want to
I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not often that people ask me questions. That's why I love it whenever they do.
Yeah, I try to ask premillennials this question. It just popped into my head.
Yeah.
So, in your view, because you think God's plan for the world is for it to get worse, and then Jesus will return. So, in my view, if I want Jesus to come back faster, if I want the end, the culmination of God's plan to come back faster, and of course we know that we can't. God's plan is static, and it is what it is.
Yeah.
But just if I want that plan to happen sooner, I will make disciples, and I will live faithfully, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I would do as much as I could to make the world a better place.
Okay.
And you might see where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I see where you're going.
So in a premillennial's view, it seems to me that if you wanted to to bring about the end, which is a good thing, we want Jesus to come back, then it should be a faithful Christian's goal to without being unfaithful, let's say, but to maybe not go out of your way in order to make the world as worse as possible, so that Jesus comes back quicker. What's stopping us from doing that?
Yeah. So I guess, that to me, again, you get into people who are watching the God channel and they're deciding they want to send the Jews to Israel to get God to come back quicker and that kind of stuff.
Jeez. Yeah.
So part of me, I think in some ways I reject the premise in that I don't think there's anything that humans could ever do, whether you're pre or post, to hasten that return. I know you said you kind of agree with that because it's God's timeline. So I can't honestly say that necessarily entered my mind, the idea of doing something to hasten his return. I do agree that we should want him to return as quickly as possible, but I think...
Well, we both can agree that we ought to be trying to structure our lives in such a way to where we want to be living in consistency with God's plan.
Yes.
And it seems to me that that's pretty hard to do if you're not a postmillennial.
Well, I'll give you my perspective on that, is that I think that our calling is, I don't think necessarily a Christian's calling, at least the way I see it, is to make the world, to bring the world to a place of this kind of utopian completion. I don't think that's necessarily what a Christian should desire or is called to do. I do think perhaps where a pre-mill would say, or would say they're trying to make the world a better place, is more about rescuing people from the impending sort of tribulation that is coming for people who don't believe. So I think that if anything would hasten it, it would be probably converting as many people as possible, so that the only people who are left are totally and completely depraved to the point where there's no, I don't know if that's even a thing, something that makes sense. But naturally, I would say our calling is to go out there and to to herald the gospel, to go out there to make disciples, to rescue people from what we see as being the what's naturally going to occur and what will happen, and that's just part of the plan, and there's no resisting that. So I see your point, and it is a good one in that we want Jesus to come back quicker, or I want Jesus to come back quicker, but I would say that my understanding of the end times would say that there are certain things that need to take place before he can come back, and that is on his timing, and it would naturally involves a lot of pain and suffering for some people. And don't ask me about the rapture, because I really am undecided on that. I don't think I've done enough research. Honestly, if you asked me a lot of these questions even 5 years ago, I think I would have given you much more gutsy, confident answers. But I feel like the older I get, the less I feel like I know. and the more uncertain I am about a lot of these things. So I think I would have seen some biblical imagery as maybe affirming a rapture at some point, but I feel like I would need to do a lot more research to be certain about that. But I don't think that should be a cop-out for a pre-mill to say that, oh, it's okay, we won't go through that anyway. I think there's a very... Because I heard someone make a really good point. They said, if you were to ask North Koreans, will there be a pre-trib rapture for believers or Chinese people, what would they say? And they would just look at you and say, we're living in it, we're in the tribulation. What do you mean there's going to be a rapture for believers? So, right. I don't know if it's going to be... I think it's going to be slightly different when everyone's going through it, but regardless, that's my opinion. I see your point of view, and I just don't share an optimism, I suppose. And I did have one other question that I was going to ask. Right, it was funny that you had one for me, and then I thought of one for you just right at the same time.
Nice.
Considering total depravity, considering that humans are so deeply flawed and depraved, what hope is there that we would do something worthy of actually making a world that's closer to God's will? I just feel like, is there an inconsistency there with saying we're totally depraved, but also that we're capable of making a world that's better than what we have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first, total depravity is not the belief that we can do no good at all.
Yeah,
total depravity just means that we naturally do not love God without God's intervention. And so even as sinners, we can do good. And my personal goal, is not to save the world. I believe that the things that I do is contributing to the body of Christ and God's plan to eventually save the world. But I don't take it upon myself to be like, I'm gonna make the world a better place. Although I think that ultimately is a natural consequence of becoming a Christian, because I see my life become better. Like my life and my local sphere around me, my family, gets objectively better as my faith increases, as my wife's faith increases, and as my church becomes stronger in their faith, they become better. And so I think, as like you said, you want to share the gospel with as many people as possible, and if those people become actual Christians and they live faithfully, then that is going to impact the world around them in a very small way. But as the gospel spreads across the earth, I think that is going to become more and more of a cumulative effect until it actually changes the world completely, and then Jesus returns.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good answer. I think just for the sake of time, I think we'll leave that for now in terms of the government side of things. But I do want to ask, just as a final point, looking at just the general political scene at the minute, it's funny because it's not something I generally go into on the show in terms of specific politics. But do you have an opinion on the two candidates that are going out there at the minute for the election, or that are going to be going up for election? Because I have some serious reservations about both of them, and not saying that I have reservations to the same degree about both of them, but we're presented with two flawed candidates, whatever way you look at it. So I'm curious as to your opinion about this idea of voting for the least worst candidate, or do you think that one of them is particularly worthy of a vote?
Yeah, I sympathize with people who think who their conscience just will not let them vote for Trump because he has said some things and done some things that shows him like a legitimate enemy of God, right? But I think between the two, there's a clearly better option. Although the way I look at it is, like you said, they're neither one of them are great options. Biden, I was thinking to myself like, which sounds weird, like I wouldn't mind, and maybe this is part of my postmillennial optimism. I was like, I wouldn't mind losing this election and Biden getting back in again, because like it's so funny that people think he is a good candidate, and it's like it's so outrageous that people
it's a self-owned
actually yeah, it's like people actually believe that men can wake up one day and make up their minds that they're women. Like there is no clearer picture of God's judgment in the world right now. So it's like whichever candidate wins is just essentially choosing what kind of judgment we're going to get.
yeah. On one hand, you've got basically we have was it Nebuchadnezzar grazing in the field or whatever? That's kind of what it feels like we have at the minute. And then on the other hand, we have, obviously Trump with his issues. And, I think my main objection is the cult of personality. I can't buy into the enthusiasm for him, because, I mean, for him to be God's man, he doesn't really act like it very much a lot of the time, or at least, some people will have us believe he's God's man. But I don't know. I was Team Ron DeSantis, and I'm biased because I'm from Florida, but I have disagreements with him as well, but I actually feel like he was actually doing stuff in our state that was furthering, again, maybe I'm more on your side than I thought, but I felt like he was furthering God's laws more than anyone else in the nation was at that time. So, that's with how he handled even abortion, the Disney stuff, where woke goes to die. That's what he said. So I'm all for that. But I just think it almost seems like an impossible situation, But I'm looking to do some episodes, for anyone watching this, I'm looking to do some episodes evaluating each candidate with a fine-tooth comb and going through them. So maybe I'll be in touch with you to see if, if that's something you might want to be a part of in the future. But I think, it'd be interesting to really dive into their policies and to actually see, is there an option here that Christians can look at and feel comfortable about voting for either one. But yeah, thank you for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a blast talking about a lot of this stuff that I don't often get to talk about, and I don't think I've really gone into the depths of postmillennial theology before. So I find that really interesting. So thank you for joining and talking about that stuff. It's been really fun.
Yeah, it's been a blast. I really appreciate the invite, and it was great for me too.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone who watched along and followed this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. If you liked it, make sure you click like, make sure you subscribe, make sure you do all that stuff. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified about new episodes coming up. And also make sure you look into our Instagram and TikTok, whether your opinions are on TikTok or whether you think it's good or not. We're out there trying to put some good content on there, so make sure you get on there if you're ticking and talking, and give us a follow and look for clips of this show. But unfortunately, that's all for tonight. Thanks again for watching. I hope to see you again soon for another episode of The Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. Thanks so much, and God bless.